Returning home to ruins. A ceasefire is in place in Lebanon, ending more than a year of conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. Will the US brokered agreement hold? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Almost 4,000 people killed, more than 1.2 million displaced, and estimated economic losses of $8.5 billion. Lebanon's Prime Minister is calling Hezbollah's nearly 14-month conflict with Israel the cruelest phase in the country's history. The ceasefire offers hope for a return to peace and a chance for people to rebuild their lives. But the agreement between Lebanon and Israel to implement what the US is calling a permanent end to hostilities has raised questions. Is the underfunded and under-resourced Lebanese army in a position to enforce the terms of the ceasefire deal? And how fragile will the situation be over the next 60 days when Israeli troops and Hezbollah fighters withdraw from southern Lebanon? We will discuss these issues with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Fintan Monaghan.
Thousands of Lebanese are returning to their homes in the south after a deal was reached to end the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. The Israeli military's bombing campaign and later its ground invasion had forced them to flee north. With the fighting now apparently at an end, they're celebrating the chance to go back to their everyday lives.
We are happy because we are returning to our land and homes in the south.
We are overjoyed. Of course, we cannot forget those who were killed or injured.
On the Israeli side of the border, Hezbollah rockets are no longer falling. But some are skeptical the peace will last.
All I know is that the campaign will be renewed sometime. It doesn't matter whether it's in 2 months or 2 years or 5 years.
The deal states Hezbollah fighters will not operate between the Litani River and the Blue Line, the UN-designated temporary border. In return, the Israeli military will withdraw its soldiers from southern Lebanon over a period of 60 days. The Lebanese army will then be responsible for patrolling the border and reporting any complaints to the UN peacekeeping force. The US and France have urged all parties to work towards a lasting peace.
We're determined this conflict will not be just another cycle of violence. And so the United States, with the full support of France and our other allies, has pledged to work with Israel and Lebanon to ensure that this arrangement is fully implemented.
Since last October, Israeli attacks have killed more than 3,800 people in Lebanon and reduced many areas to rubble. On the streets of Beirut, Hezbollah supporters see the ceasefire as a victory. But Israel is also declaring it a win.
We killed thousands of terrorists and we demolished their underground terror infrastructure near our border. Infrastructure they had been building for years.
But while the conflict in Lebanon may be over for now, Israel's offensive in Gaza shows no sign of ending. It's already killed more than 44,000 Palestinians, and ceasefire talks have ground to a halt. And as long as that war continues, regional peace may prove elusive. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Zaina Hodder has more on the mood in southern Lebanon now that the fighting has stopped. She reports from the city of Nabatea.
Tens of thousands of people are starting to return to their homes across southern Lebanon. Some are not finding any home to return to, because if you just look behind me, this is just an example of the scale of the destruction. We are in Nabatea. This city came under heavy Israeli bombardment for weeks. Every street corner, you see scenes of destruction from Israeli strikes, and the majority of the people in Nabatea left the area because it just became unlivable. The few people, the minority who stayed behind, we met some of them, and they've told us that they've lost all their life savings and they don't know what they're going to do. This is an impoverished society. Already the country was on the brink of economic collapse before Israel escalated its war against Hezbollah in mid-September. The reconstruction bill in the billions of dollars. And even if they were to start, working today to clean up all this rubble, it would take months, if not years, for people to return to their homes. Now, people here, of course, are relieved, but at the same time, they are worried because they do not trust the intentions of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, especially when he said that Israel had the right to act militarily against Hezbollah when they see any threats. For Inside Story, Zana Khudr, Nabatiye.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Beirut is Jamal Ghosn, a political commentator and member of the editorial board of Al Akhbar newspaper. In Dayton, Ohio is Randa, director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the Middle East Institute. And in Belfast is Drew Mikhael, a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute of Middle East Policy. Thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. First of all, Jamal, if I can start with you. I mean, many people, as we've heard there in those stories, are nervous around the region, particularly in Lebanon, around if the ceasefire is actually going to hold or not. What chances do you rate it that it's going to last at least the 60 days that have been outlined by Joe Biden?
I think if you saw the face of Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday as he was giving the surrender speech, basically, it was a defeat speech. It's an indicator that it will last. I mean, obviously, the US and France have put all their weight into it, and we've heard talks before Israel accepting this deal that there's talk about taking them to the UN Security Council, and that the US would not veto such a decision. So there seems to be indicators that this ceasefire would last, and this actually saves the Israeli from the trouble of continuing their quagmire in southern Lebanon, because they could not really accomplish anything militarily. Despite the widespread destruction of civilian homes, they were not able to hold any significant points or gains in any of the villages on the border. And that's after 2 months of full-on assault, supported by an open line of arms and weapons from the US and political cover from them also. And yet they failed at occupying really any significant parts of any village in Lebanon.
We'll get on to some of the compromises that both sides have had to make when it comes to the ceasefire in a moment. But Randa, just first of all, Joe Biden says that this is designed to be a permanent end to hostilities. What chances of that, and how overconfident potentially is that of Joe Biden?
Look, I think there are inherent vulnerabilities in this deal, and there are a lot of unanswered questions, especially when it comes to how violations are going to be addressed and what are consequences that are going to be imposed on the parties that violate the terms of the agreement. And however, I think both sides and their supporters, meaning Hezbollah and Israel, and meaning Iran and the United States, are interested in getting this deal done. Look, this deal would not have been made if Israel did not want it. And Netanyahu went into his speech into reasons, rationalizing why they wanted the deal. But I think the main reason is that their army is exhausted and they needed the time to regroup, and this kind of deal does not have the same political consequences for Netanyahu like a Gaza deal. The Lebanon-Israel deal is not going to sink Netanyahu's governing coalition. A Hamas-Israel deal will sink Netanyahu governing coalition. And the last point I want to make is that this deal, is done, especially in terms of the Israeli, primarily because the incoming administration in the US, Trump, has made it clear in many informal channels and to Israeli officials themselves that he would like to see this conflict end before he enters the White House. He did not say the same thing about Hamas and Gaza, but he said that. I mean, informally, he conveyed this impression to the Israeli prime minister, who, is trying to ingratiate himself as well with Mr. Trump.
Of course. even though, like you say, Netanyahu and Israel wanted this deal, it wouldn't have happened without them. Drew, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be tension around all of this. Where do you think we should watch for signs of any strain over the coming weeks? So, I mean, where are the danger areas that things could boil over, do you think?
I think to start off, Randa's point was very, very important. The fact that this agreement doesn't sink Netanyahu's government, much like an agreement with Hamas would. Considering the fact that he has to create a coalition government with rather extreme members of the Israeli government that actually will see an agreement with Hamas as capitulation. It's important that I think any outward aggression by Hezbollah towards Israel would be a particularly perilous point for re-engaging in violence. Considering the fact that Netanyahu has set himself about as a strong man, and in his speech he talked about changing the face of the Middle East, this is a very important post-October 7 Israeli position to show themselves as inordinately strong so they are able to put the fear for reprisals into potential enemies. So considering the fact that now we have an agreement on the table that is essentially, in all intents and purposes, exactly the same agreement that ended hostilities in 2006, which we then saw nearly 20 years of constant tension, I think that Netanyahu will be interested in being a lot more forceful in reprisals against Hezbollah in any kind of border skirmishes. And considering that Trump is coming into power, this will provide an X factor. Undoubtedly, he will provide military and material support to Israel that could allow a refreshening and an extra engagement of hostilities in the future.
Jamal, you said a few moments ago, you talked about the lack of progress that the Israeli military had actually made, that they didn't achieve anywhere near the goals that they had set out. I mean, but on the other side, Hezbollah has seemingly dropped its pledge to tie a ceasefire in Lebanon to one in Gaza, to ending the war in Gaza. I mean, that is a large concession from Hezbollah. I mean, were they ever really in a position to demand that?
Well, first of all, we have to wait and see what the upcoming days bring us, because we've already seen increased chatter about also an imminent deal to stop the hostilities in Gaza also. We saw the Biden administration call upon the regional partners in Cairo and Doha to put that deal back on the table and to start negotiating an end to the hostilities there. So as it's not really written in the ceasefire deal between Lebanon and the state of Israel, but there might be a tacit agreement that these are still connected, and we might see some progress. Well, at least there is increased chatter with that regards on the Gaza front. So we shall wait and see a few days to see if it's actually completely separated the fronts or the deals are connected.
Randa, along with UN peacekeepers, the Lebanese army is supposed to make sure the area Southern Lebanon is free of arms and fighters outside of Lebanese state control, which that really should have been done back in 2006 after the last major war, the agreement that this one is based on. Why do you think, will it be different this time, or do you think it will be different this time?
I think part of the difference is going to be, and that's one of the lessons learned from the failed implementation of 1701 following the end of the 2006 war. One of the lessons learned is that the implementation was not strong enough and there was no monitoring mechanism. There was a mechanism, which is the tripartite mechanism, including UNIFIL and Israel and Lebanon, but that did not work well, partly because the UNIFIL forces, even when they saw violation of the deal, by Hezbollah or by Israel, but specifically by Hezbollah, they did not report them, or they were not forcefully reporting them because of threats to the force that Hezbollah could have, have brought to the fore. And so what you have now is you have this expanded monitoring mechanisms led by a US security expert, involving French security experts, involving Lebanese representatives, involving also Israeli representative along with the UN. And there are clear lines of where Hezbollah forces have to withdraw, clear lines where the Israelis have to withdraw. There is a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces. There is a phased withdrawal of Hezbollah forces. And this is it's going to have the technological abilities to be able to monitor all of these developments in the South in a much more, timely manner than was the case in the past. That's one. Second, I think we haven't seen the annex that was part of the agreement, which included the guarantees or the assurances by the US to Israel of freedom of movement or of intervention in case there were violations by Hezbollah. But I think where we are heading next is in a kind of low-level conflict akin to what we have seen in Syria by Israel, meaning Israel, since the civil war in Syria, has had the ability and the maneuverability to go and hit Hezbollah targets, IRGC target in Syria at will, right? I think you are going to see the same. The question is, will Hezbollah then retaliate, against northern Israel? But I think that's what's going to happen. And that's one of the assurances Israel is given, is that anytime violations have occurred and they have not been addressed by the Lebanese military, they will have freedom of maneuvering to go into and try to address these violations themselves. Okay. But also the problem is that the violator is not going to be only Hezbollah. Israel is going to be the violator as well, as has been the case in the past. Indeed. And the agreement is not clear about what sanctions or what consequences are going to be imposed on Israel if it were to violate the deal.
Yeah. Drew, I just want to stay with Hezbollah for just a moment. I mean, how much lasting damage has Israel actually done to Hezbollah? And can and will they try and rearm themselves and regroup after this?
Well, I think it's almost a certainty that they can and will continue to rearm themselves, as well as it's a certainty the fact that there has been a significant amount of damage done to physically to the organization, but perhaps even more so to its reputation. The fact is that Hezbollah sets itself apart as the resistance to Israel. And as you rightly mentioned earlier, this potential nebulous decoupling from the wider Palestinian conflict is potentially a damaging one to its motif as a resistance. So how do you reassert yourself in that domain is likely to point to the Lebanese who have seen the destruction of the last 2 months and said that we, as Hezbollah, retain the need to arm and to patrol the south and to protect the land, in their words, from any Israeli aggression. And I just want to touch on Randa's point again. The fact is that we have seen a disengaged international community the last year not enforce any kind of measure of red lines. Any red lines that have been set down by the US or any other actors has been trampled on by Israel to almost no diplomatic censure at all. The fact is that this ceasefire comes after the ICC's warrant for arrest for Netanyahu, which is probably not a coincidence. The fact is that Israel continued to use tactics of war that have landed it in hot water with the ICC, and also that would have been an encouraging point for them to get a deal done to ensure that there isn't added value in terms of any kind of prosecution or arrest in The Hague. And also, I have to mention that lastly, that France's role in this as a monitor comes potentially off the back of negotiating with Israel that it will not push for any arrest warrant or trying of Netanyahu in The Hague, which is also an incredibly damaging precedent for international liberal humanitarian law and order, and could potentially seek, as Randa correctly mentioned, could potentially embolden Israel to break the terms of this agreement under spurious or evidence or very, very little evidence. So we really find ourselves relieved that the immediate bombing has stopped, but we stand at a precipice for potentially outlined and further conflict. Considering, and the last point I'll make is that there is a border negotiation to come. If the potential status of the Sheba farms is up or potentially given over to Israel, this might reignite conflict in this front almost instantaneously.
Yeah, so many repercussions of this. Jamal, I want to talk very briefly about the political situation within Lebanon. I mean, the Lebanese Prime Minister and its Speaker are both calling for cohesion and solidarity right now. But, I mean, Lebanon, as everyone knows, is politically unstable. There are significant divisions in regards to Hezbollah. What's your assessment on what the future holds politically within Lebanon now?
Well, obviously, there's going to be a change in the way the local political scene looks and is handled. We are faced with a complete failure of state institutions. We have a vacancy at the presidency of the Republic that has been for over a year, almost two. And there is the basis on which the Lebanese state has been built is shaky. And now there is a need to revisit all of that and even revisit the Taif Accords, which ended the civil war in 1990. Because it obviously did not work. It led to a failed state where they could not really function given all the divisions in the country. So a new national pact is necessary. Will they go for it? I don't know. I don't see it happening immediately, but it's a necessity if there is a future for the Lebanese state.
Yeah, I just want to talk about the Lebanese army briefly, Randa. I mean, it's underfunded. Is it really in a position to enforce the terms of this agreement and keep both sides honest? I mean, the Lebanese defence minister has said that 10,000 troops are going to be deployed to the south. I mean, does the army even really have the capability and the finances to do this? And what outside help will it actually need?
Yes, at the moment, I don't think they have the capabilities to assume all the responsibilities that this agreement places on their shoulders. I think the army has to operate according to a political consensus. That's going to be the first important prerequisite for the army to do what it's asked to do. And I think there is now a political consensus, including by Hezbollah, and among all the parties, that the army is going to do this role. It's going to go in and, monitor this buffer zone between the Litani and the Blue Line. And Hezbollah is not going to be operating there, at least for the short term. Hezbollah has severe challenges internally, organizationally to address, but also, within the country. But what's going to happen is that along with this agreement, you are going to see commitment by the international community, particularly France, the US, and many of the Arab countries, to really surge aid to the army. And there need to be a surge in terms of manpower. They have manpower shortages right now to be able to send 10,000 troops to the south and also keep peace on the other borders. That's one. And there need to be a surge in training, in equipment, in capacities. I think that will come with funding. The problem I'm seeing right now is that all these commitments have been made by an administration in the US that is leaving in less than 2 months. And so the question is that this is going to require a heavy lift going forward by the incoming administration. And I don't know if the Trump administration will have the team in place by January to be able to carry this heavy lift in a very critical transition period during which this deal is going to go through immediately.
Yeah, and as we know, Donald Trump is very much focusing domestically what is happening in the United States. Drew, if we can just stay with the US and its role here. I mean, Joe Biden has just before we were filming this, tweeted saying that over the coming days, the United States will make another push with Turkey, Egypt, Qatar and Israel, as well as others, to try and achieve a ceasefire in Gaza with the captives released and an end to the war without Hamas in power. Given that has so far failed after 14 months to get anything remotely like this across the line, how realistic is it that he could achieve that with less than 2 months to go of his presidency?
I don't think it's realistic at all, and I'm afraid to speak as pessimistically as I am currently. The fact is that Netanyahu remains the key operator in all of this, and quite frankly, his political survival and certainly his political coalition rest on his ability to completely rout Hamas from Gaza, and also, quite frankly, to appease the extreme right in his own coalition, which sees Gaza as a potential place of resettlement. And if Hamas hasn't been routed, then that is a non-starter from the get-go. Additionally, the fact is that Benjamin Netanyahu has been allowed to operate in this space for the last year because of the disengagement and the continued unwavering support of Western actors. Joseph Borrell said, lamented that there was no force capable of telling Netanyahu what to do, is patently false.
Yes.
The fact is that there are a number of different economic levers, and not even going so far as sanctioning the Israeli government, but economic levers such as denial of weapons sales to Israel that would actually have a tangible impact. Now, whether or not this all rests, a ceasefire rests on the fact that the West should be willing and is willing to actually employ these levers. If it is not, then I'm afraid that I would hedge my bet that it's more likely to see continued violence in Gaza.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. But Jamal, Randa and Drew, thank you so much for being part of this discussion on Inside Story. We really do appreciate your insight. Thank you. Thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.